killing too many whales. They didn't really listen, they didn't really do anything. So there are plenty of examples of countries kind of just ignoring what the UN says and does anyway. But, you can't lose hope. I mean, one of the beauties of being young is that you're often filled with all the hope in the world. I can change the world, I can save the world. And if you lose hope too soon, you can burn out. Like a lot of my colleagues are in their 50s and they're like, oh, this doesn't mean anything anymore, Fale. You know, I've been to these countries over and over again. It's the same old issues, the same old problems. They give up too soon. And you can't have a UN that has already given up because we owe it to the rest of the world to fight for what's right. And so hope is the only driver that keeps the UN ticking along. And without that, it becomes very ineffective. So I always say to my colleagues, you know, you can't give up, you can't give in. The whole world is relying on us to be effective.
What has been one of your biggest achievements?
As an individual?
As an individual and as a UN people.
Oh, wow. That's big. I mean, one of my biggest achievements has probably been in North Korea because the UN has a very small role to play there, but it's often one of the most important roles where we provide food security and humanitarian assistance to people who otherwise wouldn't get it because the North Korean regime wouldn't care. And so when I went in there and we identified where we could have the biggest impact, it was often with children and mothers and grandmothers, and it just reminded me so much of my own family and my own friends. It was like a human face for what I do for a living, because often it's just traveling from hotel to hotel. You don't really feel like you're making a difference, but in North Korea, on the ground, in some of those camps and in some of those settings, it made me realize that the UN can be the difference between someone eating tonight and someone not eating. And so that's the most simple example of how the UN is effective on the ground, where it's needed most. We're in Poland right now assisting with the refugee crisis there. We're in all the war zones you can think of. We're usually the first ones there alongside the Red Cross. So we do have our value, we do have our relevance, our purpose. It's just about limiting your expectations. And as an individual, as the UN, I would probably say one of the biggest success stories in the last 50 years, we have eradicated extreme poverty more in terms of scale than ever before in the history of mankind. And that's largely due to China and India alone. They're pulling more people out of extreme poverty than anyone else by far. But that's also an example of how the UN is working. We're having those tough conversations about global trade and investment, poverty, development, and that's definitely working. So we're seeing more people coming out of poverty than any other period in the history of mankind. And that's largely due to the work of the United Nations. Hi.
Hi. So you said that the UN has some sustainability goals, especially with regards to health and well-being.
Yes.
So in consideration of what's happening with COVID or what has happened with COVID, what are the new steps? Can you shed some light on what the UN is doing on that?
Of course. It's a very good question because, vaccine inequality or inequity is, it's a major concern for the United Nations. The rich countries obviously vaccinated their populations first and even bought them in excess supply in case they ran out. And a lot of the poorer countries had to wait a lot longer. And so what the UN has done, and there's also the issue of politicizing the distribution of vaccines. So countries, we won't name them, but some countries have gone to the global south and said, we'll give you vaccines with an expectation that they get something in return, or that they buy influence in those countries. And so the UN is aware of situations like that, and it's our job to expose situations like that and to ensure that there's more global equity, not just in the distribution of vaccines, but in the building of resilience in our healthcare systems. A lot of countries don't have enough ICU beds, they don't have enough spending on healthcare, especially in the global south. And so our job is to ensure that the pharmaceutical industry is commits money to where it should be going, because the pharmaceutical industry is the most profitable industry in the world. It's more profitable than oil, than military complex, anything. And so our job as a watchdog, as a mediator, is to ensure that they are doing what they're meant to do in terms of corporate responsibility. That's one of the areas where we have the most value. It's making sure that those pharmaceutical companies, be it AstraZeneca or Pfizer or you name it, we're making sure that they are putting money where it needs to be going, because they owe it to us as consumers, as governments, to do that. And so about we want to learn from COVID-19 as well. We don't want this to be the end of the global crisis and then we all go back to business as usual. So you might have heard from the UN, Build Back Better. And what Build Back Better means is making sure that when the next global pandemic comes around, we're better prepared, we're better funded, we're more resilient, we can manage a lot better. Because it's not a question of if, but the reality is when. The nature of this game now is that there will always be another global pandemic, and we need to make sure that we're better prepared.
I have a question for you on the economic development side.
Of course.
Economic development is really simple on the surface and super complex underneath it, right?
Yes.
And you mentioned how countries are now looking to diversify, or having to diversify their economies. And so I'm going to guess that it also means it leads to additional skill sets necessary in the UN. So for the benefit of the students, what kinds of key skill sets do you think are going to be high demand in the years to come?
That's a very good question. I think marketing has always been the flavor of the month in the UN because the messaging, the key messaging of the UN often gets lost in translation. When people think of the UN, it's always very abstract, very academic, very political, and so it's not very exciting. And so what the UN is doing now is we're spending a whole lot of money in rebranding ourselves to give it more of a human connection. We want the UN to look like you. It needs to be diverse, it needs to be global, it needs to be, because it's overrepresented by Europeans. The vast majority of UN staffers come from Western Europe in particular. So there's a question about the diversity of UN staffers and why the vast majority are coming from very rich countries in Western Europe. That's largely because people elsewhere are simply not applying. So it's our job as the UN to make sure that they are aware of the job opportunities at the UN and that they're applying. Because the more people we have represented at the UN at a staffing level, the more, fairer we will be as well. Because there's often a Western European bias in the way that we operate as an organization because the vast majority of our leaders, of our managers, of the people with influence come from that part of the world. So that's a very good question. Marketing, I would say healthcare now, especially with COVID-19. Education, a lot of the money that we spend is in education. So like I said before, you don't need to be a lawyer to be a diplomat. At the UN, there is something for everyone. And I want to stress that because there's a perception that you need to be a lawyer or a politician or an IR major. We do more than IR. Again, the vast majority of our money goes to development. So if you have a degree in business, if you have a degree in economic development, anything, software engineering, we have one of the biggest IT infrastructures on the planet. So, there's something for everyone. When I say that, I really mean that. So don't feel like your qualifications don't match a job at the UN. They really do. Your skills are valued. Just make sure that we're aware of that you're looking for a job at the UN, and we'll do the rest.
I have a question. Two things. What do you say to those who doubt the impact of global warming? And when you think about a continent like Africa, where industrialization is just catching up, and then you dump the environmental stewardship on those kind of economies, what are the alternative measures that United Nations are introducing to alleviate some of those interests they would have in industrializing their economy?
Of course. Yes. Thank you, sir. That's a very good question. This idea.
Excuse me, may I quickly add, the most hindrance is corruption. So please frame your justify.
Thank you very much, sir. It's a very important question because it's the same question that China and India pose to the rest of the world. We were not allowed to industrialize earlier, and now that we're industrializing, you're saying that we need to do more for the environment, but you didn't do more for the environment when you were industrializing. And so there's a question about fairness. Is it fair of us to expect the global south to spend more on global warming and climate change when the global north is responsible for most of the global emissions historically? And so the UN has a role to play there. We're kind of like the devil's advocate. We hold those global north countries accountable. But you have to understand as well that, for me, it's very personal. In the South Pacific, there are literally islands sinking as we speak. I think the island of Tuvalu, for example, has been given an extinction date. that by this date, the whole country will be underwater. So when people talk about climate change, they see it from like a scientific view, from a like equity lens. But for me, it's like my very livelihood. I could lose my whole country to climate change if it sinks underwater. And so for me, that's the kind of urgency that I bring to the UN whenever we talk about climate change. You might have noticed that the weather in the valley has changed. I think Paul told me last night that the winters are getting, the weather is all over the place essentially. So in November, it's still, and so you're seeing climate change everywhere. So to those who deny climate change, I think you just need to normalize the fact that even our weather is changing. Like, how can you deny something that's literally in your face right now, wherever you are in the world? Farmers, for example, are having to compete with changes in the weather cycle. Fishermen are having to go further out. Like in Samoa, for example, my uncle is a fisherman, and he said 20 years ago, the fish were they were just everywhere. Now I have to travel hundreds of miles just to get the same fish. So, there are so many examples all over the world of weather changes affecting livelihoods, affecting food security. And food security is definitely one of the key drivers for the UN, that climate change will directly impact food security, energy security. You look at the price of oil right now due to global supply chain constraints. How do we find alternatives to oil? The UN is wrestling with all of those challenges, but a lot of the governments aren't. So we're trying to kind of make sure we're all on the same page and that we're all being accountable, which is key to that question about corruption. Any other questions?
You mentioned earlier about this inflation, and I'm interested because I know Bitcoin helps with us being a hedge of inflation, right, from everything that we've studied. I wonder what the view of the UN is when it comes to crypto and Bitcoin, since you mentioned that you guys manage a lot of money everywhere.
Any questions?
Yes, please do.
And choose whatever sequence you
Okay.
prefer. So before we move away from the environmental concern,
Of course.
do you have any visibility on ESG conversation?
I mean, there is the issue as well that in New Zealand, for example, there's what you call the Paris Agreement and its impact on local people and communities. Like in New Zealand, we have a whole number of new taxes now to combat climate change. But what a lot of people don't realize is that it's the working class who suffer the most from those new taxes. So the carbon taxes, we've got all these new taxes. But what they do is they add them to the cost of petrol or gasoline, if you're American. And so it's the poor people and the people, it's the students, it's the farmers. Those are the people that are, suffering the most from these new climate-related taxes and climate-related policies. So we need to be mindful that climate change and the narrative around climate, it should be the businesses paying, but they're passing them on to consumers in the way of consumer taxes. And so there's the issue there about fairness and equity. Is it fair that the poorest of the community are now paying the most, the lion's share for these climate change policies and regulations? So that's a conversation that the UN is having at a global level. So we are aware of issues around that, and we're doing the best that we can. But it's also about the lack of political will. If the government doesn't know what else to do apart from taxing us more, because solving climate change is so expensive, we need to find ways to fund or finance climate action, and we don't have any other solutions. So, those are the kind of debates that we wrestle with every day. Cryptocurrency, the issue for us is that there are no regulations. There's no safety net. I know so many people who have lost a lot of money on, trading cryptocurrencies, getting access to that. But that's often the beauty of it, is the fact that it's not protected or regulated. But the UN, the only concern that the UN has is whether it's safe, whether people know what they're getting into, because often criminal networks and unauthorized government operatives are trading in that currency as well. So the UN wants to make sure that, scammers, for example, and other security concerns are identified very early on in the process. But yeah, just in the name of transparency rather. But yeah, it drips and drabs. But I think, with the new monetary system, for example, a lot of transactions are digital now. So you do kind of need a digital currency to replace the traditional currency system that we have. The economy is changing every day now. And so the UN is aware that there is a global appetite for digital currency. There's pressure on governments to even accept global currency, and there are governments already that are accepting it as legal tender. So the UN wants to get on board so that we have some kind of influence over what that looks like. But again, it's still a very new territory, and so there's still a lot of unknowns. And that's the beauty of it all, though, that it could be anything. We just don't know yet. And so we're following very closely.
So another question for you. Can you talk a little bit about what has helped to get you to where you're at today, and what advice would you have to others who aspire to have big careers too?
I mean, it can be very lonely. A lot of people have this impression of, traveling for business as being very luxurious. You stay in fancy resorts, you meet all these exotic foreigners, you try all this, amazing food. But for someone who was raised by my grandparents, and I'm the middle child of 5, I often get very lonely when I'm overseas. I spend months at a time in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, and I don't see my family unless it's on a screen. And that's not the same experience. I would rather take my brother with me to North Korea. Those are the kind of moments where I'm in a country and I'm just like, oh, if only my brothers were here to experience this with me. If only my mom was here so she could try this amazing pasta. It's often the small things like that that you really miss out on because you're a diplomat. And always talking to politicians. I don't know if you talk to politicians a lot. It can be very overwhelming because, their political personalities are obviously very superficial. And so as diplomats, you have to deal with that every day. And it can be very exhausting to deal with politicians every day because you do that for a living. But when you say big careers, I honestly think that every career is big, and that it's not about the size of your paycheck or the size of your wallet even. It's primarily that you're making a difference. And so when people are like, oh, you're so lucky, you work for the UN, you travel, it's like, yeah, but you're making a difference as a bus driver as well. You're getting children to school, and they're building their futures. You're a teacher, you're a nurse. We all play our role in society, and the UN is just one of many employers. I don't see myself on a pedestal. I'm still that same old guy from small town New Zealand. And I think you need something to go back to. When you're on the other side of the world, you need a foundation. You need to make sure that it doesn't go to your head. And that's where your values come into it, your principles. How do you make sure that you're still getting a good experience out of the UN? That's the kind of thing that guides you, that keeps you going. My spirituality, I like to exercise. Some of those things help with the stress related to the job because there aren't a lot of wins. I think there was a question earlier here about, what's your biggest win? The fact is when you're in politics, you count your blessings because the wins are not as numerous as the losses. There are way more losses. And so you do need to come to terms with the fact that you can't change everything and that Rome wasn't built in a day. And so those are the kind of problems that you're managing as an individual outside of work. Good question. Yes?
I'm curious to hear how much interaction or discussion you guys had about the Belt and Road Initiative and natural resources and the country's impact.
In China. So for those who don't know, the Belt and Road is a massive infrastructure project. It's not as successful as it used to be, so it's kind of fizzled out now, but it was essentially hundreds of billions of dollars to the, what we used to call the old Silk Road, which traveled from China all the way to Europe. They're trying to revive that concept by having a lot of trade and investment, a lot of spending on infrastructure. And the impetus for that was that they used to have this massive construction boom. So the Chinese had a lot of construction workers, a lot of electricians. But then after the boom, they had a bust. And so they needed to, to make sure that these people didn't lose their jobs, they created the Belt and Road so that they could actually go outside of China and start building outside of China. So that's the logic behind the Belt and Road. And initially, on paper, it sounds very successful, but when it was being implemented in places like Sri Lanka, for example, it didn't have the desired effect. So they didn't achieve the desired outcomes. And from a UN standpoint, we're always very wary of what we call checkbook diplomacy, which is countries pulling out a checkbook and financing a lot of these extravagant elephant projects, which are kind of designed to look fancy, but the quality of those projects are in serious doubt. And so the UN is just making sure that the countries know what they're getting themselves into when they get into projects like that. But again, China is also involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the old name for it is now something else. But the Chinese are very, very global now. And when the US was pulling back under the previous administration, China was filling that void, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. So Chinese are very clever about what they do and why. Whenever the US pulls back, it's often China that fills that void. So those are the kind of levers that we're wrestling with at the UN. It's watching all of that unfold from a geopolitical perspective, but also fighting for that underdog, which in that case was countries like Sri Lanka, Malaysia. I think Malaysia recently cancelled a lot of the projects they signed up to in the Belt and Road because of issues around quality, around fake promises and things that are still ongoing there. So, yeah, stay tuned. Hi.
So the UN has been around for a long time, I wouldn't say.
Yes.
I'm sure you do. And notwithstanding all the good things that you all do and that have done and continue to do, the world has changed dramatically, particularly in the past, I'd say, 3 to 5 years. And how do the key decision makers make sure that the UN stays, continues to be successful and adapts to changing global conditions, whether they be in education, technology, climate, etc., to achieve their mission, and especially when we see things that don't seem to, when we seem not to make progress in some things, for example, gender equality, particularly in underdeveloped countries. So the decision makers of the UN, how do they keep up with that?
That's a very good question because, as you said, in the last 5 years or so, there has been a massive rise in populism, in nationalism, in isolationism. So countries want to do less with the rest of the world because they see it as a global establishment. This is not for us anymore. It's not working out for us. We want to get out. And so the UN, in terms of how we respond to that, is that we look at our results and we celebrate our success stories. It's about messaging. I go back to that marketing perspective that if the people know, if countries know what the UN does best, they're more likely to buy into that. If they don't, then they're more likely to have their doubts. So it's our job to make sure that they know what we do best, our strengths, our potential to do better, our potential to do more. But that requires political buy-in. That requires the political will of governments. The UN is only as strong as our political will. So if the governments aren't interested in doing anything with the UN, they won't. And so it's our job to convince politicians and governments. But the trouble with that is that the governments are always changing, especially after elections. So you have a new president, a new prime minister, and when they come in, they often have a different agenda, a different sense of direction. So our job is to make sure that we're on the ground as quickly as possible whenever there's a government change, and that we're having those conversations very early on. Because the global south rely on the UN a whole lot more because there's an expectation that the global north finance the majority of what the UN does. And so that's kind of where the imbalance lies. It's that the